Okay, so we've covered 1920s and now we're going to cover 1930s, the Great Depression and the New Deal. So this decade starts off with the Great Depression, and as a reaction to the Great Depression, we have FDR's policy of the New Deal. So it's kind of easy to remember this section as the dirty 30s, as I call it, um, that would talk about in America and exactly what's going on and how this changed everything. Um, how we view government, government's job, government's role, government's influence, everything changes because of the New Deal and actually what America expects of the government. All right, so by 1929, we roughly use that as a time period where we say this is the Great Depression. Now, a few headlines on this slide I have here is I want you guys to see that here's headlines from billions lost as the stock crashes, uh, especially talking about the stock market crash and this one as well. Stock market crash happens in 1929, October 29th, 1929, but we don't usually say that's a cause of the Great Depression. It's usually used as a marker as the beginning of the Great Depression, and that's a big difference. Cause is something that we can say attributes to it. Time period is when it starts. The massive debate is that did it have an influence on Great Depression? Yeah, it did, but did it cause it directly? Like, if this didn't happen, would it still happen? And that's a hard debate to have because on 2% of people actually own stock. So as far as stock market is concerned, and the ripple effect, considering how much the Great Depression was because of the stock market, that's been a big debate. But nonetheless, we are in the Great Depression during the 30s. Um, Ups and downs is business activities in America. This is part of capitalism. We call it business cycle. There's going to be ups and downs. And if you look at a chart, you'll see, hey, America's doing great, economy dips. America is great, economy dips. And usually every 20, 30 years. This was particularly bad because the economy got way up there and way down really fast. And it does upset a lot of people, and they start thinking differently about exactly what's going on with our economy, who's to blame for that. Those bad times, those really poor times, we now call it depressions. Sometimes they're called panics. Sometimes they're called recessions. As a matter of fact, this itself, this time period, was Hoover and administration didn't want to use the word recession because it sounded bad. So he said it's a slight depression. Just like you push your foot in mud, eventually it'll go away, right? It's not a big deal. It's just a slight depression. Eventually, it will be named the Great Depression because it's the worst in our history. And you can see some of these lines or some of these pictures here. We're talking more about this one later, but this one particularly is interesting because it shows soup lines, bread lines, people waiting, people looking for jobs. Just jobs weren't available. Let me go back over here to this one. Stock market guy selling his car for $100. That is not a Model T Ford. Model T Fords were 350 brand new. That's a Dudenzinger, which is a very custom-made car, very expensive, over $1,000, I would argue. But you see how bad and desperate he is. Some of these other pictures we're going to see in other slides we're going to talk about. So let's get to when we talk about the causes of the Great Depression itself. I already talked about this in chapter or last section, but the High Smooth tariff was the highest tariff in U.S. history. It alone is going to slow down global trade so much and hurt the economy everywhere, the global economy. So that's one issue. Overproduction is another one, which literally is once people saw Henry Ford and the Model T, they replicated that. Imagine if all vacuum cleaners, washing machines, pianos, everything now is being produced cheaper and faster and more affordable. Um, Eventually, you're producing too much of it. And if I have a company and now I'm making a product, say vacuum cleaners, or producing it so much, I'm not selling as much. I'm producing too much overproduction. I'm gonna have to lay off some people. And now, once that's happening across the economy, you have less people working. Less people working means less people buying things, which means you're having more overproduction. And then people get laid off altogether. You also have a couple of issues as far as stock market goes. Buying on margin was this concept where a stockbroker came up to me and said, "Hey Keith, I got a great deal for you. $100 worth of this stock, and we could turn it into 1,000." I mean, that's great, but I only have $10. I don't have $100. Well, the stockbroker, we go to the bank, and get a loan for 90%, right? The rest of the money needed. He would take my money, the 10%, and the bank's money, and together he would buy the stock. And if things went great, bought the stock, it popped, went up. He sold that stock, took his commission, paid the bank back, and then I still got a big chunk back. Sounds great, right? Well, buying on margin, what a lot of stockbrokers did. Sometimes they didn't tell the people that. Sometimes they just did that because people didn't have that much money. But sometimes they did that. Bought on margin was when you only have 10% down. And when stockbrokers do that, and all of a sudden the market crashes and they have to pay the banks back, it's not like the bank can repo stock. In modern times, if there's a house gets repoed, the bank can come, repo it, resell it, make money back, if not make more money, right? It can salvage something. You can't salvage a loan. You can't salvage a loan for stock specifically. So buying on margin was buying only 10% down and taking a loan for the rest. Back then, there were no laws against that. There's no regulation, and they could do that, and they did in huge numbers. Also, shaky baking is an issue. Don't talk about this much. Nothing's underlined, but this was a big issue back then. In modern times, if I go to Wells Fargo and I put my money in a bank account, Wells Fargo has my money. They're not going to take it, invest it, and run away with it. Back then, that's what banks did. And you knew that actually. If you were putting your money in a bank, you were trusting the bank's stock because the bank took your money and invested that stock. If I went later to the bank to try to get that money out, they might not have that money. Like the bank might have invested all everybody's money and the stock market crashed, right? That's an issue that actually happened quite a bit. Back then, that's the way it worked. Now, there's laws against that, and we talk about that a little bit more in future. But banks could take your savings, invest in money, do whatever they want with it. Now, think about this. If I find out the bank's not doing too good, I go withdraw my money. They argue with me, but they finally give me my money. I come back, I tell people how difficult it is, or people start hearing about the banks not having money. People panic, and they all run to the bank and we call it a run on the banks, which was happening in major cities all over the U.S. People were running to banks to pull their money out because they didn't trust what the banks were doing. People had no faith in banks at that time because of the shaky banking. I call it shady banking, but no textbook says shady, just shaky. All right, so it all starts with stock market crash. Right? We had that as a beginning market. It's called Black Tuesday, 1929. But again, there's massive debate as a cause, not really so much as the beginning of it. We start seeing it, a ripple effect, jobs, foreclosures on land, foreclosures on home. In modern times, there's unemployment insurance if you get fired. So there's unemployment to help you keep afloat, help keep the economy going, help keep you pay rent, which your landlords have people in their buildings. Um, but back then, there's no unemployment insurance. There's no programs to help you out. There's nothing there. There's no government regulations. Laissez-faire, government hands out. That was the 1920s. It was all about laissez-faire, and now we're seeing the suffering from it. We know how bad it is because we're going to have people who are going to document this. You know, Dorothy Lang is a photographer during the Great Depression. She actually was really big on the Dust Bowl picture. So this is probably the most famous picture of a family trying to get a new start, giving up in Oklahoma and moving out to California, which I'll talk about more in a second. John Steinbeck writes the famous book, The Grapes of Wrath. Technically, he actually was, he wrote several articles in San Francisco, and then he would put all this education he got from these articles and all these stories together, and he would write a book called Grapes of Wrath. And it becomes well known as a perfect example of a family that came from Oklahoma in the Dust Bowl and made their way out to California. Now, the Dust Bowl was essentially the Great Plains here. No trees, it's the Great Plains. Wind is very strong. We nickname it Tornado Alley in modern times because lots of tornadoes happen all the way through North Texas, right? So you can understand the wind and the storms and tornadoes, right? Now, combine that with the fact that there was a lot of over farming. People were farming nonstop in that area for decades, and then there's a lot of drought. So people are farming, they're tearing up the land. There's a lot of loose soil. There's a long drought, so there's no rain compacting that soil at all, keeping it to the ground. You got those huge storms coming up, and essentially you have a dust bowl. You have all the perfect ingredients for a dust bowl, and that's what you see here. The after effects of a dust bowl. You can't grow crops when there's dust in the air covering the sun. That's how bad it actually was in some cases. You can't grow crops when they're covered in dirt and they can't even get sun at all ever or water. So this actually was pretty bad. And there was a huge number of people, over 1 million farmers, were going to leave Oklahoma, Dust Bowl area, head to California to try to make their way, try to start a new life. These people were known as Okies from Oklahoma. Um, as internal migration within the U.S. Over here, you actually have a picture of a pretty graphic video of a stockbroker who um, took his life after the stock market crash, which actually did happen in a few numbers. It was a majority of stockbrokers, but it did happen. That's how serious it was for some of these people. Down here, you have a migrant family trying to make it from Oklahoma, essentially to California, usually, or the East Coast, the West Coast in general, to find work. That's actually really common at the time. Okies is what they call them. Pictures from the Dust Bowl, if you want to see, like, this is actually what we're talking about. It's the after effects of a dust bowl and even a dust storm itself. You can actually look this up on YouTube. You can type in dust storm Arizona. This is exactly what it looks like, although all Arizona is more red because of clay. But we see huge storms. As a matter of fact, some of these storms is not as strong as here, but there would be storms hitting DC carrying dust from Kansas. And senators would remark that in DC, that when they were trying to pass legislation, like, look how bad it is. This was a huge environmental issue that would take years and decades to solve because we had abused the land for so long. Here you have some of the routes from these farmers trying to make it out in California and finding work out there. Eventually they would, especially once World War II happened and they're producing weapons in large numbers in California, especially for the Navy. But at first it was pretty tough. And these are pictures of families who pack up everything they own and the cars, everything they can, tie it down and just go, just head out. And this was a majority of farmers at the time giving up and trying their hand in California. Now that was internal migration. Now, migration itself has always been an issue in the U.S. If we talk about first immigration law being Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. Last chapter, we talked about the Immigration Act in the 1920s that put a quota on immigrants coming from Europe. But I was very specific to point out that there are no laws against Latin Americans. There are no rules at all. And to that extent, that's the way America has constantly been. The southern border does not exist when America needs the economic help. It only exists when America is going through economic troubles, as one professor, history professor, put it. Essentially, at this point in time in history, there are no laws. So if you could pay a small tax, pass a health test, health inspection, and a literacy test that was in Spanish, you could come to America for a visa. As a matter of fact, in 1920s, 500,000 Latin Americans are actually going to come to America and get visas and work. All right, and there's millions already in America at the time. But when the economy hits a downturn, Hoover is going to push through the Mexican Repatriation Act that is going to deport Mexican Americans. Many of these are actually citizens. Half of them were actually lawful citizens born in the United States, but didn't have documentation or weren't asked for it. And it has such an effect that by the 1930s, only 333,000 were actually given visas. So it curves Latin immigration greatly, but the real tragedy here is not only were these people facing racism, as you can see from these pictures, the signs, but even for North states like the Wyoming, Montana, they're thrown on trains, shipped to the border, put on buses, and shipped over. Many of them had never even left the United States, were born here. More than half that we believe were actually American citizens. But if you look at these statistics on this, very difficult to figure out. The range is great, but nonetheless, despite demonstrations of being there, segregated schools and everything, Hispanics were treated horribly at the time. And that's how one professor put it. He said the border only exists when America's worried about its economy, when it's a downturn. And most large farmers and corporations, they thought this was temporary. They knew this was rebound because for them, this was affordable labor. This is how they could get things done. So when we always talk about, hey, we'll never do stuff like put people in boxcars or ship them out like the Nazis did, yeah, we did it before them in the 1930s Act. Now, the president at the time is still Hoover from 29 to 32. He failed miserably. Most of the time, people refer to 1920s as the cause of the 1930s, right? 1920s is laissez-faire, pro-business, no matter what, don't interfere. Hoover had the same ideology, right? He believed in rugged individualism. We talked about that. He believed that the government should stay out, that there's business cycles will rebound from this, give it time. He did do small things. He did have the Hoover Dam. If you actually looked that up, he did that to provide jobs for peoples. But it's too little. That's too little, too late. Perfect example would be the one legislation that he does get passed, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, had this idea that said, hey, I'll give the business and the banks loans, and they can create more jobs or keep more jobs open or take that money and expand their business. And then people can get jobs. If people get those jobs, they have money. If they have money, they spend money. They spend money, helps the economy. It's called a trickle down theory. They give the big guys all the money, and eventually it pours down to the lower people. But as you can see from these cartoons, that's rarely the case, right? That is a very pro-business approach that, hey, if we help the businesses, eventually they help the people. Depression is a perfect example of how this doesn't work. And Hoover himself said that. He goes, the problem is those greedy corporate owners. They're the worst parts. They're the ones that give them a headache. And you can see it would affect his presidency because literally these shanty or shack towns that we see outside cities, like you see the big city in the background, people were popping up whatever houses they could, whatever materials they can find to build these small houses because they couldn't afford to live in the city anymore. Some people came to the city looking for work and they couldn't afford to live there, so they built these shack houses outside. These shanty towns would be eventually called Hoovervilles. That should tell you exactly how people felt about Herbert Hoover during the Great Depression. I clearly blame Hoover for this depression. So after that, you should easily be able to imagine how tough life is, right? 13 million no longer employed. We're talking about like a 25% unemployment rate. Put it into perspective, right now we're looking at 6% during this the coronavirus time period, and we think that's too high. Texas never got above 10% in '08, in the '08 recession. Detroit got well above 10%. So it depends on your state, but this point in time, 25%, one every four men couldn't find a job. Soup kitchens that were made to feed the hungry and local welfare charities, agencies, churches, they ran out of funds. Like they couldn't help anymore. And this was something Hoover, like this was Hoover's plan. He literally said, it's not the government's job to feed you. Charities should do that. Churches should take over. But they were running out of money. A man like this would give up on their families and homes, tie everything they had in a paper sack, tied to a stick, throw it over their shoulder, jump on the next train out of town to look for work somewhere else. A lot of times they came across things like this. Chamber of Commerce of the next local town. So jobless men keep going. Chamber of Commerce, they're in charge of bringing businesses to town, grand openings, things like that. But in this case, they were warning people, keep going, we can't take care of our own. And these will eventually be called, these guys jumping train to train from town to town will be called hobos. And if you actually look this up, there is a whole language, a hobo language. They use carvings and symbols to represent if a house was safe for staying a night, if the family could provide food, if they had a dog, if they were evil or bad and they could hurt you. That's symbols they would carve into like the fence or the porch or something like that. So other hobos would know. So it's pretty interesting how that develops over time. This picture right here, I like to address. It's always been shown as the perfect irony of America. In the back, this looks like it was made in the 1920s when life was great and wonderful in America, and it was. But here, you have people lined up for what appears to be a soup line or bread line during the 1930s, and they're all African American. Now, this has often been a symbol for the Great Depression, exactly how ironic, how far we went from 1920s to 1930s. But if you do research on this, this is actually after a flood. This local area had such a bad flood. It's actually one of the second worst, I think it was the second worst flood in U.S. history. And these people were staying in line. So it wasn't a Great Depression, but these people were actually staying in line because of a flood. But it's interesting how pictures have become symbols for so long that people often forget that there might be a chance that they got fake news from it, right? Bonus Army, I often forget to put this in your notes, but you need to know this actually occurred Same time period, Great Depression. World War One vets led a march. They marched to D.C. and demanded their pensions, their bonuses. They needed these. Obviously, things are tough, especially for World War One veterans. They bring their families with them. They camp out. The Senate votes against giving away these pensions. These guys, these World War One vets, this bonus army as their nickname, refuse to leave. They're going to stay there until they get their pensions. But eventually, a guy by the name of MacArthur would actually come in, and he'll use Capitol Police and local militia to remove the bonus army from the grounds of the White House, Capitol building. They're camped all over D.C. They're using violence, as you can see from his picture. MacArthur would say that he was told to do this by Hoover. Hoover would deny it and say, I had nothing to do with this. You did this on your own. MacArthur is known as a war hero after World War II, but later historians have looked back and the guy's not that great. But I am getting off topic. The bonus army themselves, they're met with violence. They're treated poorly. And so you need to think about this. If you're any time in American history, if you see veterans getting beat, you do not side with those people doing the beating. And Hoover gets blamed for this. So you think Hoover's gonna get reelected after this depression and after seeing the bonus army's veterans getting treated? You've got to be crazy. And you're right. Hoover here will lose out to this man right here. It's FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He runs on a campaign promising a new deal for Americans, right? Dramatically change things. He will win the presidency easy. He's Democrat, and Democrats will win the Senate. Democrats will overwhelmingly win the House of Representatives. And that's a theme in U.S. history. When the economy does that bad, people will turn to the opposite party, and they do so. This changes everything, and I'll mention this multiple times. The New Deal changes where now the government has a responsibility for ensuring a smooth American economy. Before the New Deal, most Americans agreed with this concept of hands off, government stay out of everything. But now, after FDR comes in and he implements his New Deal policies, Americans will look back and say, it's a good thing. We need the government to make sure the economy regulates. Not too much, not too little, but we got to find an in-between place. And that's because of FDR and the New Deal. Now, keep in mind, back then, presidents elected in November, just like now. But back then, the president doesn't take office till March, and neither does Senate, and neither does the House of Representatives. So from November, for 4 months, you've got Hoover and White House not doing anything, lame duck Congress not doing anything, and Americans are starving, literally. That's actually why we're going to pass the 20th Amendment at that point in time. That moves the president's inauguration date and Congress's new start date to January. It's because of the Great Depression we realized, hey, we got to get the president in right away. We can't have this 4 months of BS. FDR, in the meantime, he is going to gather his brain trust. His fame is known. He's going to go to academics and get the smartest professors he can find across the nation and tell them, hey, be creative. Whatever ideas we have to fix the economy, let's do this. There is no box. Think outside the box. That's going to be called his brain trust. He'll go to the radio and he'll have what we call fireside chats, where he'll address Americans on the radio weekly. And usually back then, the radios were this freaking big. So they were in your main room, which typically had a fireplace. And from his fireside to your fireside, Roosevelt would talk to you. In doing so, he explained common issues that we're having, why he's doing stuff. He explained his policies, how they're going to help you, what they're going to do, and he talk to American people. This is called the fireside chats. And you can think it did restore public confidence because you went from having these politicians all in D.C. making rules and laws that you had no clue, you didn't understand, didn't make sense. But FDR had this weekly address where he'd come to you and say, this is what's going on, this is why we need to do this. If you ever heard the phrase, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, that was one of his fireside chats. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, would be one of the, if not the greatest first ladies ever. She was big for women's rights, civil rights, peace, help the poor. People write letters to her and her husband all the time. She writes as many as she could back. She helped women's rights. She's really big on civil rights, specifically with Tuskegee Airmen. She literally showed up at the training camp. She wanted to know why these black men weren't allowed to fight in the war. This is later on in World War II. And the commanders were very hesitant to let black fighters fly planes and fight in World War II. And she shows up there and she says, hey, tells the white generals, you've been doing your job? You've been training these guys? And the general said, of course, yes, ma'am, we've been doing our job. She goes, oh, I think I took a flight around your field. And so the white generals would say, okay, let me go get my plane. She goes, no, no, no. I think I'll go with him. And she'll jump in the airplane with one of the black pilots who were clearly qualified. She jumps in. She trusts him. He flies around. She lands. She was great. And she took us to the general. Now you can tell me why you train these guys good. They fly good. I know that. They can carry me around, the first lady. Why the hell aren't they all fighting? How come you're not letting them go fight for America? So she was really big on civil rights. Probably the greatest first lady we've ever talked about. We actually started testing and asked about two first ladies, and she's one of them. As far as other women, that's important is Frances Perkins will become the first female member of a U.S. cabinet. She'll be a Secretary of Labor. And if you think that's just some minor position, this is during the Great Depression where you have to create jobs. And she'll do it for multiple terms for FDR. I think at least 3 terms, I think up until 4th term. She'll be the first female cabinet member, specifically Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. Oh, you should always read this quote. If you know, you know. If you don't, you wouldn't understand Roosevelt anyways. All right, so when we study the New Deal policies, the legislation that gets passed, firstly, most of this is done in the first 100 days. Ever since then, we've always judged presidents on the first 100 days. We're living through a time right now, we're looking at Joe Biden. We're like, all right, what does he accomplish the first 100 days? And you've got to do a lot. That's when you get most of your stuff done. That's when you won presidency. And if you won presidency, you probably got your party supporting you in the lower levels. Rarely do not have them in the Senate and the House. And when we study his New Deal policies, it's best for you to divide them up into relief, recovery, reform. And study each one and memorize each one separately. You can see some of the pictures here. Dr. Seuss will be a big role at this time period and in World War II. He is a political cartoonist. Even some of his books are actually political. You might not know this. You got FDR beating Congress into action. Usually a snail moving slow, but FDR is whipping them into shape. Here, you have sweeping changes are expected after March 4th when FDR is sworn in. Congress will give him a federal organization broom to sweep things up. And Uncle Sam, Herbert, Hoover are happy back there. They're watching this happen. But those 3 start with relief first. First, he's got to fix the banking crisis. You got to run on the banks. Everybody's drawing their money. Nobody trusts the banks. FDR declares a bank holiday. You can imagine how bad this would look nowadays, how people are like, no, you're being a dictator, blah, 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 blah. But FDR says, no, that's it. Closing all the banks, 4-day holiday. A bank can open back up when they prove to me that they're functional, that they are financially stable, and that they can do this. Not all banks open back up. Not all banks could prove that. But if they could, they open back up. And immediately he starts restoring some faith in the banks. He also wants to give relief to homeowners and farm owners. He creates emergency loans to give the banks so to stop foreclosing. You see, nowadays, if they foreclose on my house, I said this earlier, if they foreclose on my house, they could sell it. But back then, if they foreclosed on a house or home, there was nobody else with money to buy it. So foreclosing wasn't good for the banks either. So he's going to have Congress pass legislation that gives emergency loans to banks so they won't foreclose on it. And then he wants to help the unemployed. He does not, there's no unemployment insurance at all. There's no unemployment checks or anything like that. He actually doesn't believe that. He believes in work relief. And a perfect example of work relief, let's look at the first one. Let's look at this one, PWA. So the federal government would provide funds for a local town, and they could put people to work to make bridges, right? Or stadiums. Back where I'm from, there was a high school stadium made of stone. And it was actually made during the PWA. The PWA, we got a stone from local creeks, put them all together, carve them, cut them, stack them, and then created a football stadium. They made bridges. Now, what this meant was the government created these jobs, tasks for people to do, and paid them. And so people had money in local areas and helped relieve some of the problems financially that they were having. Now, they also did other things, like that was a PWA. They also had the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. That's a pretty famous one, where guys roughly 18, 19, just at fresh out of high school at that age, they didn't have families yet. The government could recruit you. You would go to a state park or a national park. You'd be put to work, a group of you, large groups, either to plant trees, build bridges, irrigation systems, whatever they were doing to make a national parks better, state parks better. and then you had that money, you usually sent it back to your family, to your parents, because you didn't have your own wife and children yet. You're too young for that. But you could take that money, send a big portion back, and help relieve the pain of not having a paycheck from your family as well. That was a CCC, usually stuck to state parks and national parks. PWA was for locals. Eventually, later on, a couple years later, he'll even pass a WPA. That was more for like murals and writings. And Dorothy Lang, the photographer, she would get paid through the WPA. After a couple of years, the FDR administration wanted to help arts and make sure the arts did not fall behind as well. So all of these are examples of work relief, right? FDR did not believe in free money. Like he didn't believe like now we feel like stimulus packages are good to help revive the economy. He wouldn't have done that back then. He did not believe in just giving money out. He thought that would make a generation of lazy people because he knew one check isn't going to get us by. He knew that this would be a constant issue. So he believed in work relief. Now, in doing so, there is hindsight. FDR is known as one of the greatest presidents for doing this. His whole New Deal plan, it was quoted as one person saying, "Hey, if you pull this off, you'll be the greatest president ever." And he said, "If I don't, I might be the last." That's how serious this Great Depression was. But there is hindsight, as people have often argued against the idea of creating these jobs because the government has to pay these people. And where does the government get that money from? They can't tax people, and that's the first guess. If you tax people, right? People aren't working to tax them in the first place. So the government goes into debt. So we're going more and more into debt to pay these people. So that's been a huge argument as well when it comes to government involvement and spurring the economy along. But now that was a relief. Recovery itself, there's a couple issues here. The idea of priming the pump has been said before. You get money into people's hands, even if the government's paying you, and people buy products. And people buy products, they're creating jobs. People create jobs, and they can buy more. And eventually, the government can pull out and stop creating jobs because jobs are created slowly. That's priming the pump. Now, there were a couple of things to make sure we recover faster. The NIRA is going to be created by FDR. It's going to give business regulations to follow, like a minimum wage, set production limits, set prices. You can't charge whatever you want anymore, right? The NRA is called the National Recovery Administration. It was part of the NIRA. That's an act, and that's just administration that carried out the act. But check this out. This is what's important. Is if you didn't notice this, it's declared unconstitutional. Supreme Court says, hey, Congress can't make those laws. Nowhere does it say in the Constitution that the government can regulate state business. You can regulate state to state commerce. Yeah, you can do that. That says it, but not within the state. So you can't do that. So FDR does take a blow right there. And then FDR has this other idea to help the farmers out. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to actually plant less, to burn their crops, slaughter their pigs. And you're thinking, why? Why are you doing this? There's people starving back east. Why are the farmers doing this in the west? With supply and demand, this whole idea that the more of a product you have, the less it's worth. So literally at some point, it was costing farmers more money to raise pigs than actually have them slaughtered. And sold, like they're losing money. So the government comes in and says, get rid of half your crop, get rid of half these pigs, half the livestock. Then your crops will be worth money and you actually start making money. But same thing, the Supreme Court's going to declare that unconstitutional. So you can't do that. You're overstepping your boundaries. 5 years later, they will have the second AAA passed. It's going to be different in that the government will buy any extra crop and store it in silos. So they'll buy this extra grain, take it off the market. So now there's less in the market and it's worth more money, and they just hide it away pretty much. That's a 5-year difference. 33, when he first tried this first one, is different. The time, things change, but we're going to get to that at the last slide in this section, actually. All right, reform. This is a big, tough one for students to remember. Now, all these I have ranked. Your notes are slightly different because they're wrong. They're messed up a little bit. But here, I put these in order of the popularity as far as the STAAR test is concerned. And when we look at these, it's actually, I've seen it seems like a lot. It is a lot. And it's best to just memorize them. I'm going to try to help you guys out. But there's actually a whole bunch of government programs during the Great Depression. And every government did it. Hitler had a huge list too. But nonetheless, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, here you may have seen this picture at a bank, and it just guarantees your deposit. The federal government said, hey, we got this bank inspected. It's guaranteed up to a certain amount. Back then, it was 100,000. I think now it's 250,000. But your money is guaranteed by the U.S. government in this bank. That's what the FDIC means. So federal deposit, your deposit in the bank is guaranteed. That's an easy way to remember that one. The next one we have is the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. If you look at this map here, you'll see that Tennessee itself is very rural. There's not a lot of electric power out here at all. Most places haven't seen electricity yet. It's 1930s at this point. But each one of these is a dam created by the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. They're going to create all these dams that are going to provide, look at all these, there's so many of them, that are going to provide electricity to locals. They're hydroelectric dams. The water turns a turbine, and in turn, that turbine turns a motor and produces electricity to the local people, which is big because these rural hillbillies haven't had electricity yet. Now they will because TVA. But also it means that they're going to buy electric products. It's going to create a demand for electric products in the area. The TVA still exists today. They still have Tennessee Valley Authority. Somebody's got to keep the dams running too. So the jobs continue pouring. TVA is actually pretty interesting. The Security and Exchange Commission. The best way to remember this one, I would say, is it was to regulate the stock market. No more buying on margin. No more insider trading. People like Martha Stewart went to jail because she committed felonies, because she traded her stock. She had insider information. SEC says you can't do that. That's illegal. You can't buy margin anymore. That's illegal. All your regulations we now have from stock market because of that government program that was created by FDR, who said, hey, we got to make sure this doesn't happen again. We got to make sure the stock market doesn't happen again. Over time, things have changed a little bit and they become more and more powerful, or less and less stronger to regulate the stock market. Stock market's become too powerful. And you've seen that in the past couple of weeks with the whole Robinhood and GameStop. We'll have to change and look at these laws again as technology improves, right? This is what's different in your notes. It's total messed up in your notes. The National Labor Retaliation Act, also known as the Wagner Act, is going to allow the right of unions. Before this, many places outlawed unions. This actually made it possible. Make sure you know that. The last one on our list is the Social Security Act. And I always find this interesting because when I teach it now, most students think of Social Security as identification. That's how you identify yourself. If you think about it, that's how they do it. That's not what it's for originally. The Social Security card was part of the Social Security Act. And it was this great concept that looked at all the elderly people in America. They're poor, they're starving, they can't work. Back then, the ratio for young to old people was 10 to 1. So think about this. And this is a hypothetical situation, if this one old guy needed $100 a month to live off of, okay, and there's 10 young people for every one old person. Well, let's take $10 out of each one of their paychecks, tax them each $10, put it all together, and give it to this guy for $100 every month for a pension, right? Great idea, right? And then they gave everybody a number to identify yourself with, so that all these young people who were doing this knew that, hey, when I get old, I'm going to use that same number and I'll be able to file for Social Security and I'll get money as well. Great concept, great idea, really solves the problem at the time. Here's our modern day issue. The ratio of old to young people now is 2 to 1. Modern technology, modern science, modern medicine plays a big role. People are living longer and older lives now. So now, if you're still taxing each person 10%, that's only 20%. Who makes up that other 80%? The government does. So the government is paying into Social Security. It's not purely coming from you anymore. That's what the government's doing to cover that. And you got to think, what's the government going to do? Like when I get old, are you going to cancel Social Security? Well, that's BS because I paid into my whole life. So that's been a massive, horrible debate ever since 1935 when it first got in place, was that idea that, hey, this is great at the time, but nobody could foresee that the future would be that many old people, the ratio would be the way it is and how it would change everything. But nonetheless, the reason why it's identification for some people is that it's a federal identification. When you think about it now, Your only other identification is your driver license or your ID. That's a state. Each state made that differently. This was a federal act, a federal policy, a federal tax. So they created that ID. So it's actually technically your only federal ID besides a passport if you have that. So that's why when you file your taxes or do anything with the federal government, they often ask for your social security number because that's how they know who you are. If it's a state issue, they might ask for your license. But nonetheless, Social Security Act passed in 1935. It's supposed to provide a pension for older people. That law actually does include unemployment insurance too. If you died early, your spouse could get your Social Security. So, FDR also has to do with monetary policy. This is a big issue. You see, Wilson had actually created a Federal Reserve Act back in 1913. Remember the big issue here was like, hey, gold versus silver. Wilson became president. He made this act that said, hey, we're going to create a system of banks. And I actually have some of the numbers right here. And each one of those banks will control all the banks in that area. And each one of all these banks will actually report to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve will control each one of these banks, and in turn, each one of these banks will control all their banks. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't want people to borrow money. They raise the interest rates. Think about it. If a bank has high interest rates on loans, we're not going to go take loans out. People across America aren't going to take loans out. Now, as the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates, so now Wells Fargo lowers their interest rates for you, and you're like paying 0.01% interest rate on a loan, yeah, you're going to jump on that. So the lower interest rates means people borrow more money. And if the Federal Reserve is printing the money, they control how much money is out there. So if they print too much money, we have inflation. So they can regulate it to make sure they don't print too much, and they keep tight form. They know how much money is out there and everything like that. So inflation is an issue at the time because the Federal Reserve does nothing. It's created in 1913 to make sure this stuff wouldn't happen, but they do nothing to stop this this at all. As a matter of fact, most of the U.S. was still on the gold standard. Even though the money was back on the Federal Reserve, most people are still using gold to trade, and FDR went as far as to outlaw gold except in jewelry. So people quit using it because it was hurting our actual money supply. And you can look at what the Federal Reserve should do and the government in relation, right? So in a period of economic depression, the government should spend more than it receives in taxes. The government can create jobs. So the government hires more workers. If the government pays people to work, they will buy more goods from other companies, and more people are employed. They buy more goods, and consumers' demands create more good production and more jobs. Meaning that, all right, so government's going to spend more money than it receives in taxes. So the government might go in debt in the economic depression. So the government's going to hire workers like FDR did. He's going to hire workers, give them jobs. Those people with those jobs, now they're going to start buying more and more goods. As they buy more and more goods, it's going to create jobs and create more production, which means more people hired in factories, working, selling, and everything. And so we have more jobs. That's during economic depression. During an inflationary period, the government should spend less than it receives in taxes. The consumers should spend less, right? If you got too much money, the government should hire less people. Consumers spend less. Businesses spend and borrow less. And you reduce consumers' demand, and it leads to lower prices. This is very rare. Rarely are we at here where we're like, oh, economy's doing so great now. Especially now that politics plays a role, and now we have presidents that actually attack the Federal Reserve. They've always been independent and never acknowledged their impressions or personal beliefs. So this circumstance here is actually pretty rare now. I don't know if we'll see this for quite a long time. We keep constantly doing this or lowering taxes altogether in general. All right, so the impact of the New Deal on labor, as far as labor is concerned, the NIRA I already talked about. It guaranteed workers' right to form unions. It was declared unconstitutional, but later on the Wagner Act will be passed. You can see the time difference here. So this one is actually 33 was declared unconstitutional because it did a few other things. The Wagner Act will be passed later, and the Supreme Court will say, "Nah, okay, you're not gonna go against that one." Okay, this has never been asked about on STAAR test, but they could. The Norris LaGuardia Act prohibited use of injunctions against peaceful strikes. The government would often go into peaceful strike and break it up. And the Supreme Court said, hey, unions are like monopolies. You can't have them. Like the Supreme Court literally ruled that. So it's pretty crazy that they thought it was legal to do that. This act by Congress said, hey, you can't do that anymore. You have to allow unions to peaceful strikes, peaceful protests are okay. You can't break those up. Before that, the government could do whatever they want. So your rights were pretty sketchy before the New Deal. But that's because the rights were always viewed as workers' rights versus property rights. Congress had always believed, Supreme Court had always believed in property rights over workers' rights. So the reactions to the New Deal, there's a few conservative critics like the Liberty League said Roosevelt was trying to become a dictator, trying to control everything. Remember, conservatives like the status quo. They don't like big government. They don't like big government spending. They want to keep that out of it. We see this in a struggle today, the right versus the left. Even right now, with a stimulus package of people starving and being poor, we have the right demanding, okay, maybe a smaller stimulus. Maybe not everybody gets a stimulus. So even now, at the point in coronavirus, whenever you're watching this, coronavirus is so bad. We have the right side still saying no, 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 no. That's the conservative side, not to spend the money, not to spend government money. But critics of the New Deal, they weren't all conservatives like the Liberty League that said, "Hey, this is too much." There's some like Francis Townshend, wanted to give all citizens 65 years and old $200 a month, which was a lot more. Like I gave an example of $100, that was way more than they actually got. He was going to give them quite a bit of money per month. Governor of Louisiana, Huey Long, this guy said every American family should get $5,000 a year, and you pay that by taxing the rich. He called it "Share Our Wealth" program. That guy was like extreme. Like he thought FDR didn't go far enough. He said everybody should get a check from government, and government should get that money from taxing the ultra wealthy. He would actually be assassinated before he can get through. And then Father Coughlin was just like his name. He was a father through the Catholic Church. He had a radio program. He demanded you nationalize all the banks and all the utilities, meaning that nationalize means that the government would take over and control and regulate it all. But he was also very anti-Semitic, blamed Jewish people, was very prejudiced on the radio. Eventually, Father Coughlin would be told by the Catholic Church, get off the radio or you're no longer going to be a father with the Catholic Church. And so he does disappear in history via warnings from the Catholic Church. They even had enough of him. Time period in the Catholic Church, pretty far. All right. So now earlier you're like, all right, Ms. Brown, what was this unconstitutional stuff you want to talk about? Well, the Supreme Court at the time were a whole bunch of old white dudes, even more than now. As a matter of fact, 6 of them were over 70 and a half years old. And FDR had looked at these guys, and these guys had found this stuff unconstitutional. The AAA, unconstitutional. The NIRA, unconstitutional. And after this one court case, the Schechner versus Poultry, the Supreme Court said even during a national crisis, Congress could not give the government more powers than that's in the Constitution. They said that stuff was not in the Constitution. You can't do it no matter what, no matter how bad things are. Roosevelt got a little worried the way they worded this. He said they might strike down other New Deal programs. And so he suggested a plan. He said that the president should be allowed to add, the Supreme Court should expand. Every time a justice hits 70.5 years old, should add another justice until they retire. To him, these guys are old, they're out of date with reality, they know what's going on. And he agreed with the concept that, hey, you can't fire them, you can't just get rid of them, you can't set age limits, you can't do that. Because the whole point of a Supreme Court justice is that they're not limited their life term, so they're not influenced by politics, right? It's supposed to be. But he said, hey, once they hit 70 and a half, they're too old. They're not in touch with the real things going on anymore. He said, if they hit that, we should add one. At the time, out of the 9, 6 of them were over 70 and a half years old, which means if we replace 6 of them, it would go to 15 justices. And who appoints the Supreme Court justices? Who picks them? The president. So people looked at this and they nicknamed this the court packing scheme. They said, this is FDR's way of packing the courts and being able to control the courts. And they said, no, that's not okay. You can't do that. Now you look like you're becoming a king, a tyrant, because you've got the presidency, you've got one branch. You definitely got legislative branch. Senate and House is again and again Democrats are winning elections because they're doing something with the economy. They're making it better versus the Republicans who believe not doing anything at all. So you've got both those branches. Now you're trying to control the third branch, and that's just too far. So a lot of people said, hey, enough's enough. You can't do that. Democrats and Republicans alike in Congress said, no, this is becoming too powerful. You shouldn't do this. So this is like the biggest downfall of FDR's whole career, really, when you look at it, is this court packing scheme. He was willing to do this. Now, I will tell you this on a side note. STAAR says once you know a court packing scheme is they give you cartoons and ask you stuff about it. That's kind of given. On a side note, the Supreme Court realized how close they came to really screwing things up. And almost I want to say every single legislation that's passed afterwards with the New Deal, they did not override and declare unconstitutional. They were way more open minded after this. They kind of got their stuff together, I guess you could say. All right, so to summarize this up, the biggest thing underneath the New Deal, all these programs, is a theme here. The government increased dramatically, the federal government increased dramatically, right? No longer was the government simply permitted dishonesty. No longer were they just here just say, hey, no more of this, no more of this. Now they had the responsibility to keep the economy running smoothly. And we're used to that now, right? We're like, hey, this is your job to make sure things don't get out of hand, make sure we have good production, make sure we have jobs. Back then, they didn't think of it like that. They say, oh, well, whatever, government stays out of it. And now your federal government will be involved in your everyday life. From your Social Security to your taxes out of your paycheck, now they're deeply involved. Some of these agencies still exist today. Social Security, TVA, SEC, the regulated stock market, all this stuff, FDIC, so many of these still exist today. And that's because people looked at, Americans looked at and said, hey, things are so bad in our economy, they can get really bad. And the government's job is to make sure they don't get bad again. The government has to step in for some part, at least somewhat. And that rounds up the Great Depression and the New Deal of the Dirty 30s.